I'm Sarah Chen, 45 years old, and for 15 years, I poured my heart and soul into Pinnacle Marketing Solutions. I built client relationships that generated millions in revenue, mentored countless junior staff members, and watched this company grow from a scrappy startup to a major player in Denver's marketing scene. But 3 weeks ago, Marcus Whitfield, my regional manager, walked into my office and fired me on the spot to make room for his golf buddy, Derek Thompson, a man with zero marketing experience but apparently a killer handicap. What Marcus didn't know was that during my decade and a half at Pinnacle, I'd been meticulously documenting every unethical decision, every financial irregularity, and every legal violation in my personal files. When you're a woman of color in corporate America, you learn early that keeping records isn't paranoia, it's survival. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My story begins not in the gleaming towers of downtown Denver, but in a small apartment in Aurora, where my immigrant parents, David and Lucy Chen, worked multiple jobs to keep our family afloat. My father spent his days as a mechanic at a local garage and his evenings driving for a delivery service, while my mother balanced shifts at a textile factory with weekend work cleaning office buildings. They arrived from Taiwan with engineering degrees that weren't recognized in America, but they never let bitterness consume their dreams for their children. Every night at our small kitchen table, they would help me with homework while reviewing English language textbooks, determined that education would be our family's pathway to a better life. Money was always tight in our household, but my parents made sure I understood the value of integrity and hard work. When I was 12, I found a wallet containing $300 at the grocery store. My father walked me back to customer service to turn it in, even though that money would have covered our groceries for 2 weeks. He looked at me seriously and said something I've never forgotten. "Sarah, your character is built in moments when no one is watching. The person you become when it's difficult to do the right thing is who you really are." Those words would guide me through every challenge I'd face in my professional life. High school wasn't easy for a shy Asian girl in a predominantly white suburban school, but I threw myself into academics and debate team. My parents couldn't afford college prep courses or expensive tutoring, so I spent countless hours at the public library, teaching myself advanced concepts and preparing for standardized tests. The librarian, Mrs. Patterson, became an unexpected mentor, staying late to help me research scholarships and navigate college applications. She saw something in me that I hadn't yet recognized in myself, constantly pushing me to apply for opportunities that seemed beyond my reach. Through a combination of academic scholarships, work-study programs, and weekend jobs, I managed to attend the University of Colorado Boulder, where I majored in marketing with a minor in business administration. College opened my eyes to possibilities I'd never imagined, but it also highlighted the economic disparities between myself and many of my classmates. While they spent spring breaks in Cancun, I worked double shifts at a local restaurant to cover textbooks and living expenses. Yet these experiences taught me resilience and resourcefulness that would prove invaluable in my career. During my junior year, I landed an internship at a small marketing firm in Boulder. The owner, Margaret Sullivan, was a trailblazing woman who had built her company from nothing in the male-dominated advertising world of the 1980s. She became my first professional mentor, teaching me that success in marketing wasn't just about creativity or analytics, but about understanding human psychology and building genuine relationships. Under her guidance, I learned to craft campaigns that didn't just sell products, but connected with people's deepest aspirations and fears. Margaret's firm specialized in working with local businesses and nonprofits, which meant every client relationship was personal and every campaign had to deliver measurable results. I discovered I had a natural talent for understanding what made different demographics tick, whether I was developing a campaign for a family-owned restaurant or an environmental advocacy group. More importantly, Margaret taught me the importance of ethical marketing practices, showing me how to be persuasive without being manipulative, and how to build long-term success rather than chasing quick wins. After graduation, I was offered a full-time position at Margaret's firm, but she encouraged me to explore opportunities at larger companies to broaden my experience. It was difficult advice to accept because I loved the intimate, family-like atmosphere of her small business, but I knew she was right. My first corporate job was at Pinnacle Marketing Solutions, which in 2009 was still a mid-sized firm with about 40 employees and a reputation for innovative campaigns and ethical business practices. David Harrison, the founder and CEO, had built Pinnacle on the principle that effective marketing should benefit both clients and consumers. The company culture was genuinely collaborative, with regular team lunches, transparent communication about company performance, and opportunities for professional development regardless of your position on the organizational chart. I started as a junior account coordinator, eager to prove myself and contribute to campaigns that I believed were making a positive difference in the business community. My first major assignment was working on a campaign for a local nonprofit that provided job training for homeless individuals. The project was challenging because we needed to raise awareness about the organization's services while also changing public perceptions about homelessness in Denver. I spent weeks researching the issue, interviewing program participants, and developing messaging that highlighted both the dignity and potential of people experiencing homelessness. The campaign exceeded all expectations, increasing donations by 40% and significantly boosting enrollment in the job training programs. This early success established my reputation within Pinnacle as someone who could handle sensitive projects with both creativity and respect for the human stories involved. Over the next few years, I was promoted to account manager, then senior account manager, building a portfolio of clients that ranged from innovative tech startups to established healthcare organizations. Each campaign taught me something new about the intersection of psychology, technology, and human behavior that drives successful marketing. One of my proudest achievements was developing a public health campaign that helped reduce teenage smoking rates in Colorado by 15% over 2 years. The project required extensive collaboration with medical professionals, educators, and teenagers themselves to create messaging that resonated without feeling preachy or condescending. Instead of relying on scare tactics, we focused on empowerment and authenticity, featuring real teens talking about their goals and aspirations rather than lecturing about health risks. The campaign won several industry awards, but more importantly, it demonstrated the potential for marketing to create genuine social impact. By my 5th year at Pinnacle, I was managing a team of junior staff members and overseeing multi-million-dollar client relationships. The company had grown to over 100 employees, but it still maintained the collaborative culture that had initially attracted me. David Harrison continued to prioritize ethical practices and employee development, regularly hosting lunch and learn sessions where team members could share expertise across departments. I felt like I was part of something meaningful, building both my career and contributing to campaigns that reflected my values. During this period, I also began documenting my work more meticulously than most of my colleagues. This habit started innocently enough, as a way to track campaign performance and identify successful strategies that could be replicated for other clients. However, my parents' emphasis on preparation and Margaret Sullivan's mentorship about the importance of protecting yourself in corporate environments had taught me that thorough documentation was essential for professional survival. I kept detailed records of client communications, project timelines, budget allocations, and campaign results, storing copies of important documents in both digital and physical formats. As Pinnacle continued to expand, the company culture began to shift in subtle but concerning ways. David Harrison brought in new executives to manage the growing complexity of the business, including Marcus Whitfield as regional manager for the Western Division. Marcus came from a large advertising conglomerate in New York with an impressive resume and promises to take Pinnacle to the next level of growth and profitability. Initially, many employees, including myself, were optimistic about the fresh perspectives and resources he might bring to our campaigns. However, it quickly became apparent that Marcus had a very different philosophy about business relationships and employee management. Where David Harrison had emphasized collaboration and transparency, Marcus preferred top-down decision-making and information compartmentalization. Team lunches became infrequent, then disappeared entirely. The open-door policy that had allowed any employee to discuss concerns with leadership was replaced with formal appointment scheduling and hierarchical communication protocols. Most concerning, Marcus began making decisions about client strategies without consulting the account managers who had built those relationships over years of careful cultivation. The first major red flag occurred during my 8th year at Pinnacle, when Marcus overrode my recommendations for a healthcare client's campaign strategy. I had spent months researching patient demographics and consulting with medical professionals to develop messaging that was both compelling and medically accurate. Marcus dismissed this work and implemented a strategy based on outdated assumptions about patient behavior, resulting in a campaign that not only failed to meet its objectives, but also generated complaints from healthcare professionals about misleading information. When the client expressed dissatisfaction with the results, Marcus blamed my team's execution, rather than acknowledging the fundamental flaws in his strategic approach. This incident prompted me to begin documenting Marcus's decisions and their outcomes more systematically. I started keeping copies of email exchanges, meeting notes, and client feedback in a secure personal folder, separate from Pinnacle's internal systems. At the time, I told myself this was simply professional due diligence. But, deep down, I recognized that I was protecting myself against potential future conflicts. My parents' lessons about preparation and Margaret's warnings about corporate politics had taught me that in business, your word against someone else's often comes down to who has better documentation. Over the next several years, my documentation revealed troubling patterns in Marcus's leadership. He consistently took credit for successful campaigns developed by his staff, while deflecting blame for failures onto individual team members. He showed clear favoritism toward male employees, promoting less experienced men over qualified women and minorities. Most problematically, he began cutting corners on campaign research and client consultation to reduce costs and inflate profit margins, often resulting in less effective campaigns and frustrated clients. Despite these concerns, I continued to excel in my role, eventually being promoted to Senior Account Director, with responsibility for Pinnacle's largest and most complex client relationships. My portfolio included a major healthcare system, 3 technology companies, and a prominent nonprofit organization, generating over $12 million in annual revenue for the company. I had built genuine partnerships with these clients based on trust, consistent results, and deep understanding of their business objectives and target audiences. My success wasn't just measured in financial terms, but in the long-term relationships I had cultivated and the positive impact our campaigns achieved. The healthcare system's patient education campaign improved treatment compliance rates by 28%. One of the technology companies successfully launched 3 new products using strategies I developed, establishing them as a leader in their market segment. The nonprofit organization tripled their volunteer recruitment and doubled their fundraising through campaigns that authentically communicated their mission and impact. These achievements had not gone unnoticed by David Harrison and other senior leadership, who regularly acknowledged my contributions in company meetings and performance reviews. However, Marcus's relationship with me became increasingly strained, as my success highlighted the shortcomings in his own strategic thinking and leadership approach. Rather than learning from effective practices or seeking collaboration, he began looking for opportunities to undermine my authority and question my decision-making processes. The tension reached a breaking point during my 14th year at Pinnacle, when Marcus attempted to reassign my largest client to a less experienced male colleague without explanation or consultation. I pushed back through proper channels, documenting my concerns and requesting a meeting with David Harrison to discuss the situation. The meeting revealed that Marcus had been providing selective and misleading information about my performance, painting a picture of someone who was difficult to work with and resistant to new strategic directions. Fortunately, my documentation and client relationships spoke for themselves. David Harrison reviewed my performance metrics, client feedback, and campaign results, quickly recognizing that Marcus's characterization was inaccurate and potentially motivated by personal conflicts rather than business considerations. The client reassignment was reversed, and Marcus received what appeared to be a strong warning about fair treatment of staff members and accurate performance reporting. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. However, this victory came at a cost. Marcus's resentment toward me intensified, and he began looking for other ways to marginalize my influence within the company. He excluded me from strategic planning meetings, withheld information necessary for client management, and began making subtle comments about my attitude problems to other executives. I responded by documenting these behaviors even more meticulously, creating a comprehensive record of discriminatory treatment and unprofessional conduct that I hoped would never be necessary but felt compelled to maintain for my own protection. The beginning of my 15th year at Pinnacle Marketing Solutions started with what should have been a celebration. I had just secured the largest contract in company history, a 3-year partnership with Colorado Health Network that would bring in $18 million in revenue. The negotiation process had taken 8 months of careful relationship building, strategic presentations, and countless revisions to our proposed campaign framework. Colorado Health Network was notoriously selective about their marketing partners, having worked with the same agency for over a decade before deciding to explore new options. My success in landing this contract wasn't accidental or lucky. It was the culmination of years of expertise in healthcare marketing, deep understanding of regulatory requirements, and genuine relationships with key decision-makers throughout the organization. I had identified an opportunity to help Colorado Health Network modernize their patient communication strategies while maintaining their reputation for medical excellence and community trust. The campaign I proposed would integrate digital outreach with traditional media, focusing on preventative care education and improved patient engagement across diverse demographic groups. The contract signing took place on a crisp February morning in David Harrison's office, with representatives from Colorado Health Network expressing genuine enthusiasm about our partnership. Dr. Patricia Valdez, their chief marketing officer, specifically mentioned how impressed they were with my understanding of healthcare communication challenges and my track record of successful campaigns in the medical field. She emphasized that their decision to work with Pinnacle was based largely on confidence in my leadership and the specialized team I had assembled for their account. After the clients left, David Harrison pulled me aside for a private conversation that I initially assumed would be congratulations and discussion of my well-deserved bonus for securing such a significant contract. Instead, he shared concerns about recent conversations with Marcus Whitfield regarding the company's strategic direction and staffing optimization. According to David, Marcus had been advocating for a more streamlined organizational structure that would reduce redundancy and improve operational efficiency across all departments. The conversation felt strange and somewhat ominous, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly why at the time. David seemed uncomfortable, avoiding direct eye contact and speaking in the kind of corporate euphemisms that usually signal difficult decisions ahead. He mentioned that Marcus had been reviewing performance metrics across all divisions and identifying opportunities for organizational improvements that would position Pinnacle for continued growth in an increasingly competitive marketplace. Looking back, I realized that David was probably trying to warn me about something he couldn't directly articulate, perhaps due to pressure from Marcus or other executives who had been advocating for changes in personnel. At the time, however, I interpreted his comments as general business concerns rather than specific threats to my position. After 15 years of excellent performance reviews, successful client relationships, and consistent revenue generation, the possibility of my job being in jeopardy seemed absurd and paranoid. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into launching the Colorado Health Network campaign with characteristic enthusiasm and attention to detail. The project required coordinating efforts across multiple departments, managing a team of 12 specialists, and maintaining constant communication with various stakeholders throughout the client organization. Despite the complexity and high stakes involved, everything was proceeding smoothly, with early metrics indicating that our strategies were resonating strongly with target audiences. During this period, I began noticing Marcus spending increasing amounts of time with Derek Thompson, a man I had seen around the office occasionally, but knew very little about professionally. Derek appeared to be in his early 40s, well-dressed and confident, with the kind of easy charm that opens doors in corporate environments. However, whenever I encountered him in meetings or casual interactions, it became apparent that his understanding of marketing principles and industry practices was superficial at best. Derek would make comments during strategy sessions that demonstrated fundamental misunderstandings about consumer behavior, campaign measurement, and regulatory requirements. When discussing digital marketing tactics, he would reference outdated approaches that had been abandoned by the industry years earlier. Most concerning, he seemed completely unfamiliar with the ethical guidelines and legal restrictions that govern healthcare marketing. Despite the fact that Colorado Health Network represented our largest and most visible client in that sector, Initially, I assumed Derek was a consultant or temporary advisor helping Marcus with some unrelated project. However, as weeks passed, his presence became more prominent and his involvement in account discussions more frequent. During team meetings, Marcus would defer to Derek's opinions on matters where Derek clearly lacked expertise, creating awkward situations where more knowledgeable team members had to diplomatically correct misinformation or redirect conversations toward productive territory. The situation became more concerning when I learned through casual conversation with Jennifer Rodriguez in Human Resources that Derek had been officially hired as a senior strategic advisor reporting directly to Marcus. This information surprised me because senior-level hires typically involved input from multiple departments and consultation with relevant account managers, especially when the new hire would be working on established client relationships. The fact that Derek's hiring had proceeded without my knowledge or involvement, despite my responsibility for the accounts he would presumably be advising on, struck me as highly unusual and potentially problematic. My concerns deepened when I discovered that Derek's background was not in marketing or advertising, but in financial services, specifically commercial real estate development. His most recent position had been as a development coordinator for a property management company that specialized in strip mall construction and leasing. While business experience in other industries could certainly bring valuable perspectives to marketing challenges, Derek's lack of any relevant education or practical experience in marketing, advertising, or healthcare communication made his senior-level appointment difficult to understand from a business perspective. More puzzling was the apparent speed and secrecy of Derek's hiring process. Typically, senior positions at Pinnacle involved multiple rounds of interviews, reference checks, and consultation with relevant department heads to ensure cultural fit and professional qualifications. Derek seemed to have bypassed these standard procedures entirely, suggesting either an emergency hiring situation or some kind of special arrangement that circumvented normal human resources protocols. My suspicions about the nature of Derek's appointment were confirmed during a casual conversation with Patricia Williams, one of our senior account managers who had been with Pinnacle almost as long as I had. Patricia mentioned that she had overheard Marcus and Derek discussing golf strategies and upcoming tournament schedules during what was supposed to be a client strategy meeting. According to Patricia, their conversation suggested a personal friendship that extended well beyond professional collaboration, with references to shared weekend activities and family social events. This revelation reframed Derek's sudden appearance and rapid promotion in a much more troubling light. Rather than being hired based on professional qualifications or strategic business needs, it appeared that Derek had been brought into the company primarily because of his personal relationship with Marcus. This kind of nepotistic hiring was not only unfair to other potential candidates who might have been better qualified, but also potentially dangerous for client relationships and company performance if Derek was placed in positions requiring expertise he didn't possess. My documentation habits, which had been focused primarily on Marcus's decision-making patterns and their business consequences, expanded to include observations about Derek's involvement in company operations and his apparent lack of relevant qualifications. I began keeping detailed records of meetings where Derek provided input that contradicted established best practices, instances where his recommendations could potentially harm client relationships, and examples of Marcus deferring to Derek's judgment despite Derek's obvious lack of expertise in relevant areas. The situation escalated dramatically during a strategy session for the Colorado Health Network campaign in early March. The meeting was intended to review preliminary results from our initial patient education outreach and discuss adjustments to messaging and targeting for the next phase of the campaign. I had prepared comprehensive data analysis, showing strong positive responses from target demographics and specific recommendations for optimizing our approach based on empirical evidence from the first month of implementation. Derek attended this meeting despite having no previous involvement in the Colorado Health Network campaign and no background in healthcare marketing. Throughout my presentation, he interrupted repeatedly with questions that demonstrated fundamental misunderstandings about healthcare communication regulations and patient privacy requirements. When I explained the legal and ethical constraints that shaped our messaging strategies, Derek suggested approaches that would have violated federal guidelines and potentially exposed both Pinnacle and Colorado Health Network to significant regulatory penalties. Most disturbing was Marcus's response to Derek's inappropriate suggestions. Rather than correcting the misinformation or redirecting the conversation toward productive territory, Marcus praised Derek's fresh perspective and innovative thinking. He suggested that perhaps our approach had been too conservative, and that Derek's ideas deserved serious consideration, despite their obvious legal and ethical problems. This exchange demonstrated either Marcus's own ignorance of healthcare marketing requirements or his willingness to prioritize Derek's ego over client safety and regulatory compliance. After the meeting, I immediately documented the entire conversation, including specific quotes from Derek's suggestions and Marcus's supportive responses. I also sent a carefully worded email to both Marcus and Derek, ostensibly thanking them for their input, while actually creating a written record of the regulatory concerns I had raised, and the potential consequences of implementing Derek's suggested approaches. This email would later prove crucial in demonstrating my efforts to protect both the company and our client from potentially disastrous strategic decisions. The following week brought another alarming development when I learned that Marcus had scheduled individual meetings with each member of my team, ostensibly to gather feedback about campaign performance and team dynamics. These meetings were conducted without my knowledge or participation, which violated established protocols for team management and represented a clear attempt to undermine my authority as senior account director. When team members asked whether they should include me in these discussions, Marcus specifically instructed them to keep our conversations confidential. Amanda Foster, one of my junior account managers, was particularly troubled by her meeting with Marcus and chose to share details despite his instructions for confidentiality. According to Amanda, Marcus had spent most of the meeting asking leading questions about my management style, decision-making processes, and team collaboration approaches. His questions seemed designed to elicit negative responses or identify potential areas of dissatisfaction that could be used to justify future personnel decisions. Most concerning, Marcus had specifically asked Amanda whether she felt that my leadership approach was too rigid or controlling, whether she believed the team would benefit from fresh strategic direction, and whether she would be interested in taking on additional responsibilities if opportunities for advancement became available. These questions strongly suggested that Marcus was building a case for my removal and potentially positioning Amanda or other team members to support that decision when it was implemented. Amanda's account of her meeting was consistent with feedback I received from other team members who chose to share their experiences despite Marcus's confidentiality instructions. The pattern that emerged was clearly designed to undermine my authority, identify potential internal support for my removal, and create justification for whatever personnel changes Marcus was planning. The fact that these meetings were conducted secretly, without my knowledge or participation, demonstrated both unprofessional behavior and possible violations of company policies regarding team management and employee relations. I immediately expanded my documentation to include detailed accounts of these secret meetings, including dates, times, participants, and specific questions that were reportedly asked. I also began documenting my team's responses and their concerns about the inappropriate nature of these conversations. This information would prove valuable in demonstrating the systematic nature of Marcus's campaign against my position and his willingness to manipulate subordinate employees to achieve his objectives. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place during a chance encounter at Mountain Brew, the coffee shop where many Pinnacle employees grabbed lunch or took breaks between meetings. I was waiting in line when I overheard a conversation between Marcus and Derek at a corner table, apparently unaware that their voices were carrying across the relatively small space. Their discussion was casual and personal, focused on weekend plans and family activities, but it included several references that clarified the true nature of their relationship. Derek mentioned that his wife was looking forward to their upcoming vacation together, referring to joint travel plans that included both couples. Marcus discussed strategy for their next golf tournament, mentioning handicap adjustments and practice schedules that suggested a long-standing recreational partnership. Most revealing, Derek thanked Marcus for making this opportunity possible and expressed confidence that everything would work out exactly as planned, using language that strongly implied prior discussions about Derek's role at Pinnacle and its intended outcomes. This conversation confirmed my growing suspicions that Derek's hiring and increasing influence were part of a predetermined plan rather than legitimate business decisions based on company needs or Derek's qualifications. The personal relationship between Marcus and Derek explained the irregular hiring process, Derek's rapid elevation to senior advisory roles, and Marcus's consistent support for Derek's inappropriate suggestions during client meetings. It also suggested that my removal from the Colorado Health Network account, and possibly from Pinnacle entirely, had been discussed and planned before Derek was even officially hired. Armed with this understanding, I intensified my documentation efforts and began preparing for what seemed like an inevitable confrontation. I organized my files systematically, creating comprehensive records of Marcus's discriminatory behavior, Derek's lack of qualifications, and the potential risks their collaboration posed to client relationships and company performance. I also began discreetly consulting with Jennifer Rodriguez about company policies regarding nepotistic hiring and discriminatory treatment, framing my questions as general inquiries about best practices rather than specific complaints about current situations. The confrontation came sooner than I expected, on a Friday afternoon in late March, when Marcus requested an impromptu meeting in his office. I had been expecting some kind of dramatic showdown, but the actual conversation was surprisingly brief and matter-of-fact. Marcus informed me that Pinnacle was, quote, restructuring the account management division to improve efficiency and strategic alignment, and that my position as senior account director was being eliminated effective immediately. When I asked for clarification about the restructuring and how my responsibilities would be redistributed, Marcus explained that Derek Thompson would be assuming oversight of the Colorado Health Network account and other major client relationships. This announcement confirmed my worst fears about the true purpose of Derek's hiring and the systematic undermining of my authority that had been occurring over the previous months. Marcus attempted to frame this decision as a strategic business choice rather than personal favoritism, but his explanation was transparently inadequate given Derek's complete lack of relevant experience. I requested documentation of the restructuring decision, including business justifications and transition timelines, but Marcus claimed that such details were still being finalized and would be provided later. When I mentioned my 15 years of excellent performance and the recent success of the Colorado Health Network contract, Marcus dismissed these achievements as past performance that didn't necessarily predict future effectiveness in Pinnacle's evolving business environment. The meeting concluded with Marcus informing me that security would escort me from the building and that my personal belongings would be packed and delivered to my home address. This immediate termination protocol was typically reserved for employees suspected of misconduct or security violations, not senior staff members with exemplary records who were supposedly being laid off due to restructuring. The degrading nature of this process, combined with the obvious inadequacy of Marcus's explanations, made clear that this termination was punitive rather than business-related. As I walked through the office for the final time, accompanied by a clearly uncomfortable security guard, I felt a mixture of anger, sadness, and determination that surprised me with its intensity. Anger at the injustice and unprofessionalism of my treatment, sadness at leaving colleagues and clients I genuinely cared about, and determination to ensure that Marcus and Derek would face appropriate consequences for their actions. The documentation I had been maintaining for years would finally serve its intended purpose, but first I needed to process the emotional impact of this betrayal and plan my response carefully. That evening, sitting in my home office surrounded by 15 years' worth of carefully organized files, I began preparing for what would become the most important presentation of my professional career. Marcus and Derek had made a critical error in their assumption that I would quietly accept this injustice and disappear without challenging their actions. They were about to discover that underestimating someone who had spent years documenting their mistakes was a very expensive miscalculation. The weekend following my termination felt surreal, like waking up from a 15-year dream into a nightmare I couldn't quite comprehend. Saturday morning arrived without the familiar rhythm of preparing for another day at Pinnacle, without the anticipation of client calls and strategy meetings that had structured my adult life for so long. Instead, I found myself sitting in my home office, staring at filing cabinets that contained what I was beginning to realize might be the most comprehensive documentation of corporate malfeasance ever assembled by a single employee. My documentation system had evolved organically over the years, starting as simple performance tracking and gradually expanding into a sophisticated archive of questionable decisions, policy violations, and ethical breaches. What began as professional self-protection had become an inadvertent investigation into systematic corruption within Pinnacle's leadership structure. As I opened the first filing cabinet, I was struck by the sheer volume of evidence I had accumulated, organized chronologically, and cross-referenced by topic, client, and personnel involved. The earliest files dated back to my 6th year at Pinnacle, when Marcus first arrived and began implementing changes that seemed designed more to consolidate his personal power than improve company performance. I had initially documented these changes as a way to understand new corporate procedures and adapt my work accordingly. However, as patterns emerged over time, my documentation became more focused on identifying and recording behavior that seemed inconsistent with Pinnacle's stated values and legal obligations. One entire drawer was devoted to what I had labeled financial irregularities, containing evidence of expense account abuse, unauthorized budget reallocations, and questionable vendor relationships that Marcus had developed without proper oversight or approval processes. These files included copies of receipts for personal expenses charged to client accounts, email exchanges discussing budget manipulations to hide cost overruns, and contracts with suppliers who appeared to have personal connections to Marcus rather than competitive qualifications for their services. The expense account documentation was particularly damning, showing a pattern of personal charges disguised as business expenses that totaled nearly $200,000 over 6 years. Marcus had routinely charged personal golf outings to client entertainment budgets, family vacation expenses to business travel accounts, and home improvement purchases to office supply categories. Each individual charge might have been explained away as a mistake or oversight, but the cumulative pattern demonstrated systematic fraud that violated both company policies and federal tax regulations. Even more concerning were the budget manipulation records, which showed Marcus redirecting funds from approved client campaigns to cover shortfalls in other accounts or to inflate his department's apparent profitability. These transfers were often accomplished through creative accounting that obscured the true costs of campaigns and made it difficult for senior leadership to accurately assess project performance or resource allocation. In several cases, clients had paid for specific services that were never delivered because the funds had been quietly diverted to other purposes. The vendor relationship files revealed another layer of corruption, with Marcus consistently awarding contracts to companies owned by friends and associates, rather than conducting competitive bidding processes required by company policy. Derek Thompson's brother-in-law operated a printing company that had received over $300,000 in business from Pinnacle, despite consistently higher prices and slower delivery times than established suppliers. Marcus's golf partner owned a catering service that provided food for company events at rates 20% above market standards, with the additional costs absorbed by client entertainment budgets without their knowledge or consent. A second drawer contained what I called personnel violations, documenting Marcus's discriminatory treatment of female and minority employees, his retaliation against staff members who questioned his decisions, and his systematic promotion of less qualified candidates based on personal relationships rather than professional merit. These files painted a disturbing picture of a manager who used his authority to reward loyalty and punish independence, creating a toxic work environment that drove talented employees away while protecting incompetent cronies. The discrimination documentation was extensive and specific, including records of identical performance reviews, where male employees received higher ratings and larger salary increases than female employees with superior metrics. I had tracked promotion patterns over Marcus's tenure, showing that men were promoted an average of 18 months faster than women with comparable qualifications and performance records. Minority employees faced even greater obstacles, with promotion rates 50% lower than their white counterparts, despite similar educational backgrounds and work quality. The retaliation files were equally troubling, containing evidence of Marcus's systematic punishment of employees who had challenged his decisions or reported concerns through proper channels. Staff members who had raised questions about budget allocations found themselves excluded from important meetings and passed over for advancement opportunities. Employees who had complained about workplace harassment were subjected to increased scrutiny and criticism that seemed designed to force their resignation rather than address their legitimate concerns. Most disturbing were the records showing Marcus's protection of clearly incompetent employees who happened to be his personal friends or golf partners. Derek Thompson was not the first unqualified individual Marcus had hired and promoted beyond their capabilities. Over the years, he had created a network of loyal subordinates whose primary qualification was personal allegiance rather than professional competence, gradually replacing skilled employees with cronies who would support his questionable decisions without challenge. The third drawer focused on client impact documentation, containing evidence of how Marcus's poor leadership and unethical practices had directly harmed Pinnacle's client relationships and campaign effectiveness. These files included client complaints that had been suppressed or ignored, campaign failures that resulted from Marcus's interference with proven strategies, and instances where his budget manipulations had prevented delivery of promised services to paying clients. The client complaint records were particularly valuable because they provided external validation of internal problems, showing how Marcus's mismanagement affected people and organizations outside Pinnacle, who had no reason to fabricate concerns. Healthcare clients had expressed serious reservations about compliance violations in campaigns that Marcus had approved despite legal warnings from my team. Technology companies had complained about outdated strategies that Marcus had insisted upon implementing despite evidence that such approaches were ineffective with their target demographics. Several files documented campaign failures that had cost clients significant revenue and damaged Pinnacle's reputation within specific industry sectors. A pharmaceutical client had lost FDA approval for a product launch campaign because Marcus had overridden my team's recommendations about regulatory compliance, insisting on messaging that violated federal guidelines for prescription drug advertising. A nonprofit organization had seen donations decline by 30% after Marcus had implemented fundraising strategies that contradicted established best practices and ignored demographic research about their donor base. The budget manipulation impact on clients was perhaps the most legally problematic aspect of Marcus's behavior, as it involved taking money that clients had paid for specific services and using it for other purposes without their knowledge or consent. In several cases, clients had paid for premium research services that were never conducted because Marcus had redirected those funds to cover shortfalls in other accounts. Digital advertising campaigns had been scaled back without client notification to provide budget flexibility for Marcus's other priorities, resulting in reduced campaign effectiveness and failure to meet contracted performance metrics. Beyond these organized categories, I had also maintained what I called my insurance files, containing recordings of meetings where Marcus had made statements that clearly violated company policies or legal requirements. Colorado is a one-party consent state for recording conversations, which meant I could legally document these interactions without informing other participants. Over the years, I had accumulated dozens of hours of audio evidence showing Marcus making discriminatory comments, discussing fraudulent expense reporting, and planning retaliation against employees who had challenged his authority. The recordings were particularly valuable because they captured Marcus's actual words and tone, making it impossible for him to claim that his statements had been misunderstood or taken out of context. In one particularly damaging recording from a department meeting, Marcus had explicitly stated that he preferred hiring men because women were too emotional for high-pressure client relationships. Another recording captured him instructing Derek on how to manipulate expense reports to hide personal charges, providing step-by-step guidance on fraudulent accounting practices. Perhaps the most damaging recording was a conversation between Marcus and Derek from just 2 weeks before my termination, where they discussed their plan to remove me from the Colorado Health Network account and eventually force me out of the company entirely. In this conversation, Marcus explicitly acknowledged that my performance was excellent, and that my removal was motivated by personal dislike rather than business considerations. Derek's responses demonstrated his understanding that he was unqualified for the responsibilities he would be assuming and his reliance on Marcus's protection to maintain his position despite his obvious inadequacies. As I reviewed 15 years of documentation, I realized that I possessed what amounted to a comprehensive case study in corporate corruption and mismanagement. The evidence was overwhelming, carefully organized, and legally admissible, representing thousands of hours of meticulous record-keeping that had been conducted with no expectation that it would ever be used for legal purposes. My parents' lessons about preparation and Margaret Sullivan's warnings about protecting yourself in corporate environments had led me to create what was essentially a complete investigation into Marcus's misconduct. The question now was how to use this information most effectively to achieve justice not just for myself, but for all the employees and clients who had suffered under Marcus's corrupt leadership. Simply filing a wrongful termination lawsuit would address my personal situation but might not prevent future victims or ensure comprehensive reform of Pinnacle's management practices. I needed a strategy that would expose the full extent of the corruption while protecting innocent employees and preserving the company's ability to serve its legitimate clients. My first step was to organize the evidence into a comprehensive presentation that would clearly demonstrate the systematic nature of Marcus's misconduct and its impact on employees, clients, and company performance. This presentation would need to be persuasive to multiple audiences, including David Harrison and the board of directors, potential legal authorities investigating fraud, and possibly regulatory agencies concerned with compliance violations in our healthcare and financial services campaigns. The evidence I had assembled was more than sufficient to destroy Marcus's career and potentially result in criminal charges for fraud and embezzlement. Derek's involvement, while less extensive, was clearly documented as knowing participation in nepotistic hiring and fraudulent business practices. However, my goal was not simply revenge against two individuals, but comprehensive reform that would prevent similar corruption in the future and restore Pinnacle's reputation as an ethical organization that truly served its clients' interests. As Sunday evening approached, I felt a sense of purpose and determination that had been absent since my termination. Marcus and Derek had made a critical error in assuming that I would quietly disappear after being dismissed. They were about to discover that 15 years of careful documentation had created a weapon far more powerful than they could have imagined, and that their attempt to destroy my career would instead become the catalyst for exposing their own corruption to the light of justice. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.